Good Shepherd Sunday. It's kind of interesting because almost any time that I have been in a clergy group, now in the lectionary study group, and the Good Shepherd rolls around. It always rolls around the lectionary. I have never been in a group of clergy. There were broken bones. There were skin grafts that would have to take place. And there he was, and the nurse was talking about the gravity of his injuries and how he was lucky to be alive. And so he said, well, at least I didn't kill that fuzzy little bunny. And my colleague said that he caught the nurse's eye, and she caught his eye, and they probably were both thinking the same thing. How stupid that you would try to frame this as some kind of noble sacrifice. Let's see. You're going through incredible amounts of pain. You've lost incredible amounts of income and will continue to do so while your family is dependent upon you. You're running up major hospital bills, and yet you think that this all can seemingly be justified because, well, you didn't kill that fuzzy little bunny. Sometimes we rationalize decisions that we make. But when we come to this story, I thought about that rabbit and I thought about sheep. Because that's what we do. We try to count up what stuff is worth, its value. I mean, that's the nature of being Westerners, Americans. What is the value of something? And oftentimes the value isn't the intrinsic value, rather it is what's it really worth as a commodity, right? When you think about bunnies, there's similarities. The bunny has fur and lamb has wool. A little different there, but still, they got something growing on their bodies, and neither one are particularly aggressive, somewhat defenseless, not known to be overly bright, though one of my colleagues this week in the study group who's preaching let me know pretty quickly that she'd read about lambs, and apparently lambs are fairly intelligent, just below the pig on the intelligent chain. I never really saw them as overly intelligent. We know that they're very stubborn. So you kind of value this out. What is a lamb's worth? What is a lamb's life worth? Really? Well, when this story was being told and John was writing it down, actually the lamb was worth quite a bit. There was obviously the food source. There was the wool for clothing, which was pretty important. There were skins that could be used for shelter. There was a sacrificial religious system still in place, and lambs were worth something on that market. Also, they could be used for bartering for other goods. So when somebody kind of says, well, is this really a bad deal for the shepherd that he's willing to lay down his life for a sheep? Is the sheep worth that? We do those kind of comparisons. For instance, if a woman jumps in to save a child who's drowning and ends up drowning, then that we see as a noble sacrifice, a courage. She tried to make this effort to save something. But if a guy refuses to give a mugger his only $5 and gets shot and killed, then we don't really see that as anything noble. We kind of say, well, that's kind of stupid. We do this. We compare this to this to this. What's interesting here is in the Hebrew Scriptures, there is a Mishnah, which are writings that were interpretations, kind of a commentary, if you will. And there's actually criteria laid out for shepherds. Who knew? Which is why we get that piece in this text. Well, some shepherds run away from the wolf. because they're just hired hands. Where that comes from is that if you're a shepherd and one wolf shows up, it's your job, no matter what, to defend the sheep. It's just one stinking wolf after all, right? And these are terribly valuable. However, if 2 wolves or more show up, then it's okay to run away and let the flock fend for themselves, because after all, 2 wolves have better odds than 1 wolf. So there was a value index placed in the interpretation. That's what. So we get this thing from John. Well, the shepherd, the wolf comes, and if he's a hired hand, he'll run away and leave him, because that's all he is, just a hired hand. All of that kind of stuff, as I walk through the scriptures, I found interesting. But here's the thing when I read the text that comes to me over and over again. The Good Shepherd simply gives and doesn't have to. Frankly speaking, what we know is there's a lot of lambs in the world, a lot of sheep in the flock, but we know that some of them are dressed like, they may be dressed up like sheep, but some of them are wolves when you look underneath. The shepherd chooses to give. We may not like being compared to sheep, but in Jesus' day, they were valuable and they mattered to the people who owned them. This says that the shepherd simply laid down his life for the sheep. There was no bargaining, there was no comparison, there was no looking, well, what can I get for these sheep? What are these sheep worth? Are they really worth this? Are they really valuable? Are some of them, maybe we could barter and sacrifice, or we don't get any of that, because that's the point of the story. John's Jesus simply says, I'm the shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Not counting value, not talking commodities, not talking worthiness. The shepherd knows the lambs, and the lambs know the shepherd, and the shepherd is willing to lay it all down because the shepherd sees in the sheep intrinsic value. Now, for those of us who have spent good pieces of our life trying to earn enough brownie points to keep God from swatting us, think about that. For those of us who have spent our lives worried about guilt and shame and all that other stuff because we're not sure we're good enough, or that we deserve this or we deserve that, hear those words. The Good Shepherd knows us and lays down his life for us. For those of you who may not be totally familiar with religious language, that's what we call grace. Such a beautiful thing, that grace. There's no brownie point list. There's no black mark list. There's no comparing this for that. There is simply a shepherd who loves and cares for each of us. Oh, there's one more thing that gets thrown in here that sometimes people scratch their heads about. For those of us who think we're the only sheep that matter, did you read what it said? The shepherd says, there are other sheep. And you thought you were the only sheep that mattered. There are other sheep Now we know where commentators have gone with us through the years, talking about Gentiles, and that's probably a good interpretation, except the problem is that John may be one of the most anti-Semitic books in the Bible, because every time you turn around, somebody's afraid of the Jews. Whether it's the Gentiles or not, there's a clear statement here for those who were listening in that don't assume that you're the only sheep that the shepherd cares about, because that would be a mistake. And so, if you start going out and judging other sheep using other labels and saying, "No, I'm in the in crowd. I've got a shepherd," you better go back and hear those words from John. There are other sheep, and I'm going to bring them along, and there will be what? One flock. I like the grace part. I haven't decided yet whether I like the fact that everybody gets it. But I like the grace part. The shepherd loves me, wants me, lays down his life for me. And maybe some of you too. Because that's who God is. That's what Christ taught. That's how Christ lived. This is always the good news. It's not earned. We're not weighed. It's not how much wool we produce. We're just loved. And the Good Shepherd lays down his life because we are who we are. Sheep. That's good news, I think. It's good news for me, and I hope it's good news for you. Maybe a bad deal for the shepherd, but it's a good deal for the sheep.